Hello, guys. Welcome back. We're going to continue on in chapter 11 for this week. We're going to be looking at the facial bones and the orbits. What you'll notice about the projections this week is that they are exactly the same for both the facial bone and the orbit. So, even though in the PowerPoint presentation I have put in there uh, its own slides for the facial bones and the orbits, the projections are absolutely the same. We're going over the exact same projections. So hopefully this PowerPoint won't be as long since we've gone over a lot of these projections before. There's really one new projection that we're learning. So hopefully it'll go by quickly and we'll get into it. So let me bring up the PowerPoint here. All right. So again, sorry, I got to change that. There's no sinuses. I had a PowerPoint presentation that originally had sinuses in it, but I need to take that out. It's just the facial bone and the orbit today, but I'll fix that before the PowerPoints are posted. All right. So this is the routine that we're going to be looking at for today for the facial bones. First one is the lateral, which we've done before, lateral skull. This is going to be just a little bit different centering because we're focusing more on the facial bone than the entire skull. Then we do a parietal cantilever waters, which is the same exact position we've done for the other waters that we've done. A Caldwell, again, focusing more on the facial bone, but the same positioning. And the new one we're going to learn is the modified parietal cantilever or modified waters. Okay. So again, first thing for lateral. Again, what we're looking for here is we're looking for fractures, any pathologies of the facial bones itself. So when we look at facial bones, let's go to this guy here. All right, we'll go to the skull. All right, so if we turn him to the side, right, all we're looking for facial bones is basically from there down to the maxilla and there. That's all we're looking for facial bones, all of this area here. We're not too concerned about the mandible because, again, the mandible, if we need to look at the mandible, we'll do a mandible projection. All right, so KVP is 70 to 80, all right? We're going to put them in an erect or semi-prone, whichever one is more comfortable. Obviously, if it's a bigger, more hyperstenic patient, you want to do it erect. It just makes it easier. Semi-prone sometimes is more comfortable for the patient. Get the head in a true lateral position. So all of those four criteria that I talked about before with, let me turn this down because I know some people are like, do you get, I can hear your notifications. All right. So the four criteria are still true for this lateral, like for any other lateral we've done, right? To get in a true lateral, you need to make sure that mid-sagittal plane, right, is in a is parallel to the image receptor. Make sure that the IPL is perpendicular to the image receptor. The IOML is perpendicular to the front edge of the image receptor, and then the GAL is parallel to the front edge. Okay, so make sure all four of those things are true. Make sure there's no rotation or tilt of the head. Get in a true lateral. CR is going to be perpendicular to the IR, and we're going to center to the zygoma, or midway between the outer canthus and the EAM. So let me show you. Go back to this one here. All right. So again, in a lateral, right? Again, we want to make sure that we center midway between the outer canthus. I'm sorry. The outer canthus and the EAM. Right, or right to the prominence of the cheek, right? So you kind of want to center in this area here, all right? It's kind of midway between the outer canthus and the EAM. That's where you want to center your CR, all right? Right on that bump of the cheek is really where you want to center. All right? Once you've done that, you collimate and you suspend respiration and you take the exposure. Okay, so again, important things to remember is to get them in a true lateral position, right? You want to make sure that, let's see if I can show it here without my screen getting all right. So we want to make sure that that IPL, right, which goes across here, is perpendicular to the image receptor. Okay. We want to make sure that the mid-sagittal plane, which comes down this way, is parallel to the image receptor. Right. We want to make sure that the IOML, right, which is this line down here. Let me take off this background because it is not looking good. So let's do none. All right, a little bright back there, but that's all right. All right, so again, if you want to make sure that IOML, right, which is this line right there, right, is going to be perpendicular to the front edge of the image receptor, right? So if the front of the screen here, right on the side, is the edge of the image receptor, you want this line to be perpendicular to that line. Okay, and then also the GAL, which is the front here, needs to be parallel to to the front edge of the image receptor. Right? So all four of those things, if you get all those done, then you will have a true lateral position. Okay, once you've done that, suspend respiration, make the exposure. Here's what it looks like. All right, you want to make sure that all the facial bones are in the center of the image receptor. So if we look here, right, all the facial bones are in there. We don't necessarily care about the mandible there, but you can include it. We really want from the maxilla on up to the orbits, okay? If they're in profile, then you have a good lateral. We want to make sure that there's no rotation or tilt. So we want to make sure that we look at these structures that are going to be for rotation and tilt, right? So remember, what is the first structure we look for to determine rotation? Okay, and of course it's going to be anterior posterior separation. The first thing you're going to look for is the mandibular rami, right? So if you notice, there's only one line there. Okay, so that means that they're pretty well superimposed, right? If they're superimposed, there's no rotation. All right, and the other parts of the anatomy that you can look at for rotation would be the EAM, which is right here, right? The sella turcica, and then the greater wings of the sphenoid, which are right there. Okay. Now, if we're looking at tilt, right, we can again look at those three structures, the EAM, the sella turcica, and the greater wings of the sphenoid. However, the first structure you should look at would be the orbital plates or orbital roofs, right, which are right here. Okay, now we do see that there's one there and there's one on top, right? So that means that there is a little bit of superior inferior separation, which means that there is tilt. All right, so that's the structure again you look for tilt, and then for the rotation you look for the mandibular rami. Okay, and of course make sure your optimal exposure factors are there, sharp lines, bony trabecular markings. Okay. Next projection is the parieto-canthal Waters projection. Now, when we're looking at facial bones, the lateral is going to be, and let me go back to the lateral, kind of give you some indications of what you're looking for these projections of the facial bones. So the lateral facial bones is just kind of a general overview of all of the facial bones. So you get a lateral view of all of the facial bones, right? So there's not one particular facial bone that we're concentrating on. It's just a general of everything. Waters, kind of the same thing. But for this one, we're paying attention more to like the zygomatic arches, the orbits themselves, the nasal bone. So that's kind of more what we're looking at there. It does give you a better projection of some of the anatomy, like the bony nasal septum, the inferior orbits. We can see those on the Waters, zygomatic arches, of course, some of the maxilla. So we want to make sure that we include all of the facial bone anatomy when we're doing these projections. Okay. So for the Waters projection, 75 to 85 kVp, 40-inch SID. Again, do it erect is the preferred, just in case there's any type of injury where you need to see some kind of air fluid level. Then the erect position would be preferred, but you can't do it prone. All right. So what you're going to do again is you're going to extend the head and place the chin on the image receptor, right? And you're going to bring the MML, right, the mental-meatal line, perpendicular to the image receptor, right? So basically just raise the chin, place the chin on the image receptor, and have the MML perpendicular to the image receptor. Make sure there's no rotation or tilt, and you're going to have your CR perpendicular to the IR, which means no angle. Remember, it is a parieto-acanthial projection. That means it's entering the parietal bone, exiting the acanthion. Okay, so should the exit right under here underneath the nose, exit the acanthion, collimate, suspend respiration. Right, and remember the little trick I told y'all is open up that light field, right, and look for that crosshair that's coming across the table here. That crosshair should go right underneath the acanthion. Right? Collimate, suspend respiration. Now remember, with the Waters projection, we want to make sure that the OML, right here, the OML forms a 37-degree angle with the table. Okay, so if you look here, right, again, if I was to draw this OML out, right, and then you have it angled with the table, that right there should form 37 degrees. Okay. The reason for that, again, is it helps to make sure that the first of all, that you're in a correct position of the patient, and also it helps to make sure that the Peters ridges are going to be well below the maxillary sinuses. Okay. Collimate, suspend respiration, make the exposure. All right. This is kind of just showing you another, showing you the erect position of the parieto-acanthial. All right. So again, still chin on the image receptor. The MML, which you can see here, is perpendicular to the image receptor. All right. Same thing here. all right? It's still forming a 37-degree angle between the CR and the OML. I'm sorry, between the OML and the table, right? Which you can see here and you can see here, all right? That's important because, again, helps to make sure that the petrous ridges are going to be below the maxillary sinuses. Okay. Here's what it looks like. Again, we want to make sure that all of the facial bones are in the radiograph. So you do have the zygomatic arches, which are right there. They are in there. The entire orbit is in there. You see the bony nasal septum. You see the the maxilla here. All right. You do see some of the mandible there. The mandible is not necessary, but it is shown on there. All right. So again, this is used for a lot of different structures, right? You have your maxillary sinuses right in there. The black arrows point to the petrous ridges. Okay. Again, how do we make sure that we have a correctly positioned waters? We are going to look for those petrous ridges in relation to the maxillary sinuses. And again, they need to be below the maxillary sinuses, right? Here is the bottom of your maxillary sinuses, right? This triangle that you see there on each side, those are your maxillary sinuses. Ridges are well below, all right? We don't want them to be too far below where they're going to be down here, because then what happens is you get the bottom of the orbit start getting into the top portion of the maxillary sinus, which we don't want to see, okay? But if you're too low, right, if you're not extended enough, then you see these ridges projected into the lower half or the lower part of the maxillary sinuses, okay? If you see those ridges in the lower part of the maxillary or within the maxillary sinuses, then you did not form a 37-degree angle between the OML and the table, okay, or the image receptor. So we do want to make sure that we see the ridges below, remember. So if you put your fingers here, right, if you extend your head, your maxillary sinuses are right here. Right, let me take off the share. Right, maxillary sinuses are right here. So if I don't extend my head, my ridges are within my maxillary sinuses. But if I extend, right, now they're going to be below the maxillary sinuses. Okay, so make sure that you have enough extension on there. All right, no rotation, again, demonstrated by the distance between the lateral orbital margin and the lateral cranial cortex, or the side of the eye and side of the head. Oops, let me go back. All right, so if we go from there to there, there to there, it looks pretty much the same, right? So it means there's no rotation, okay? Make sure you have good optimal exposure factors, sharp lines, bony trabecular markings, all right? Next one for the facial bones is the PA axial Caldwell, which we've done before with the skull. 75 to 85 kVp. Again, this will best show the supraorbital margin of the orbit. So the top of the orbit is what we're looking at here, but we're also looking for other parts of the facial bone series. Okay, so it does give a different perspective of all the facial bones. We're just looking for any fractures or pathologies. 75 to 85 kV, 40-inch SID. All right. Patient is either erect or prone, right? Erect, again, is preferred because if there is any air fluid levels, we need to see that. Now, when you position the patient for all PA projections of the skull, right, of the head, it doesn't matter what it is. You're always going to put the nose and forehead on the table, or the image receptor. Because when you do that, it helps to place the OML perpendicular to the image receptor, right? So again, forehead, nose on the image receptor, get that OML perpendicular, okay? If you need to, you may need to flex the neck a little bit more to get it perpendicular to the image receptor. Make sure that there's no rotation, no tilt of the head. And it is a Caldwell projection. So whenever you hear Caldwell, you're always going to think 15-degree angle, right? And remember, the 15-degree angle is between the CR, right, the CR, which is here, and the OML, which is there. Okay, so the angle, if I also draw this OML out, right, and then I also draw this 15-degree angle there, that again would form the 15-degree angle. Okay, and that's what makes it a Caldwell. All right. Once you've done that, you're going to center to exit at the nasion. So nothing has changed from when we did it for the skull and other projections. Still going to exit the nasion, collimate, suspend respiration. Really, the only thing that changes between these projections that we've learned for the Caldwell is your collimation. Because for the facial bone, you're going to collimate a little bit more to make sure you include the facial bones, whereas the skull, you needed to, open up the collimation to get the top of the head. So again, nothing has really changed. We still want to make sure we have that 15-degree angle between the CR and the OML. We still want to make sure we're flexed to bring the OML perpendicular, center to exit at the nasion, 15-degree angle. Okay, collimate, suspend respiration. Here we go, right? So just like any other Caldwell projection, we do want to see the ridges in the lower 1/3 of the orbit, which we do here, right? So there are the ridges, right? Lower 1/3 of the orbit, good Caldwell. However, we do have some issues here, right, with collimation, because if it is a facial bone projection, we want to make sure we see all of the facial bones. So we are kind of clipping off some of the facial bone on the side there. We don't want to do that. We want to make sure we include all the facial bones. Now, if you don't include some of the mandible down here, which is fine. If you don't include some of the frontal bone, that is fine because it is a facial bone projection. But the sides there, where we clipped off, we really want to make sure we have our zygomatic arches in there. Okay. Um, Make sure there's no rotation, no tilt, right? Again, rotation is the lateral cranial cortex to the side of the head if it's the same distance. And basically just look for structures that should be symmetrical, right? Like the orbits. Do the orbits look symmetrical? Yeah, they do. Okay. You got this half over here of the where the nasal bones are, or where the uh, bony nasal septum and all that is. So if all that it looks symmetrical, then there's no rotation, right? You can also use the ridges, right? If these pyramids look the same, then there's no rotation. Okay. Now, again, if you have an issue with the ridges being too high or too low in the orbits, then you have some issues with angle or flexion extension, right? And this is always going to be the case, right? So if you see them too high, right? They're kind of up here in the going towards the top of the orbit. That means that the angle between the CR and the OML is getting less than 15 degrees, right? So it's getting more towards zero. Two things can happen with that. Either you overflex the head, right? Or you didn't increase or you didn't angle enough. Okay. So those two things can cause the ridges to go high. Now, if you see them down here too low, then that means you had too much angle between the CR and the OML, which means you either angled more than 15 degrees, your CR was angled more than 15 degrees, or you extended the head too much and brought that OML back and caused a greater angle. Okay, so just kind of go back over that because that's always going to be something that we ask about if you see problems with the ridges within the orbit, how do you correct it? Okay, and then the last thing, the optimal exposure factor is sharp lines, bony trabecular markings. All right, the last one for the facial bones is the modified parieto-acanthial waters projection, modified waters. So this one is very similar to the waters, except we're going to change the positioning line and the extension of the head a little bit. This one here is we're looking for orbital fractures and in particular to the bottom of the orbit. Okay, so you can imagine that this projection will also be used for the orbits, which we'll be talking about next, right? So this one here will best show the bottom of the orbits. 75 to 85 kVp, 40-inch SID, again, erect or prone on the table. So this one here, you're going to start off with the head extended to put the chin on the image receptor, okay, to bring that MML perpendicular. But then what you're going to do is you're going to decrease the extension of the head and bring the LML perpendicular, which is the lips meatal line. So if you look over here on the picture, right, we're going to get that, should be from here, wherever the lips are, right? The lips meatal line should be perpendicular to the image receptor. Okay, so again, here's my skull, right? Normally on a waters projection, we bring the chin up. I'm trying to get it correct here, right? Bring the chin up, put that on the image receptor, right? But now what we're going to do is we're going to decrease the extension and put the lips meatal line perpendicular to the image receptor, right? So everybody see that line that goes from the junction of the lips to the EAM, that should be perpendicular to the image receptor, all right? So you do decrease the extension a little bit. You're not going to have it extended as much. Now, let me go back. Now, when you do that, again, make sure that you do have the LML perpendicular to the image receptor. Important thing there is that the OML is going to form a 55-degree angle between the OML and the table. So if we look at this here, right, that line to the table now is at a 55-degree angle. And remember last time it was at a 37-degree angle with the regular waters, right? So when we put the MML perpendicular, you get a 37-degree angle between the between the OML and the table. When you put the LML for the modified, you have a 55-degree angle between the OML and the table. Okay, so there's no rotation, no tilt, CR perpendicular to the IR. You're still going to center to exit at the acanthion. That hasn't changed. Okay, collimate and suspend respiration. All right, so some really three changes occur here on this modified, right? First thing is that you're going to have the LML perpendicular instead of the MML, right? So for waters, it's mml, modified is LML. Okay, that's the first change. Second change is going to be that the angle between the OML and the table is now 55 degrees for modified waters, and it's 37 for a regular waters. Okay, second change. The third change is the position of the Petrus ridges in relation to the maxillary sinuses. So with the regular waters, where were the ridges in relation to the maxillary sinuses? Right? So if you said that they should be below the maxillary sinuses, correct. However, with a modified, the ridges are actually going to be in the lower half of the maxillary sinuses, which is what we want. Okay, so again, we're going to decrease our extension, which means that these ridges are going to come now into our maxillary sinuses. Okay, so those are the three areas that have changed, right? So make sure you make note of that. The LML is perpendicular instead of the MML. 55-degree angle between the OML and the table instead of 37, and the ridges are now in the lower half of the maxillary sinuses as opposed to below the maxillary sinuses. Okay. Column A, suspend respiration. So here's our image, right? Again, we are looking at where are the ridges in relation to the maxillary sinuses. So again, here are your maxillary sinuses. And if you notice, there's a line going across there. The ridges are in the lower one half, right? They are filling this lower one half. So that is a correctly positioned modified waters, right? The orbital floor should not be distorted. So this right here gives us the best view of the orbital floor, okay? Again, best view of the orbital floor for this projection, all right? Make sure there's no rotation, no tilt, and then make sure you have optimal exposure factors, right? Now, there's a lot of issues with this radiograph. They've kind of coned down. I think they're focusing more on the orbits here. But if it's a facial bone projection, make sure that you include all of the facial bones, right? Marker shouldn't be there, right? That's in the way. But again, this was just coned down just to kind of get the orbits, right? So that's the main difference between the modified and the regular waters, right? So it's the position of those ridges, the angle that's formed between the OML and the table, and then the positioning line that's perpendicular to the image center. Okay. So that took care of the facial bones, right? So really, lateral, Caldwell, and Waters, we all knew already, right? We went over that last time. Modified is the new one. So that's kind of the one where you need to make some new notes on. Now, we're going to talk about the optic foramina or the orbit, right? So they call it orbits. You may hear it as optic foramina, but it's kind of interchangeable, right? But it's more the orbits projection is what we're looking for. Okay, so for the orbits, this is going to be the routine here. You have a parietal canthal Waters, which we just went over, a PA axial Caldwell, which we just went over, and a lateral facial bones, which we just went over, right? So all of those projections, I've listed the page numbers there, are going to be facial bone projections. In the text, there is really only one orbit projection in there, but that's not even testable in the registry anymore. So what they want to test you is on these projections of the facial bones, which include the orbits. So I've put the page numbers there. They refer back to the facial bone projections in the text, okay? And then, of course, the last one is that modified waters, which we just talked about, again, on page 423, still part of the facial bone. Let's see. Actually, I need to update these pages, okay, because I believe, see, the waters is correct. The Caldwell is correct. Okay, so the modified is 422, but I will correct that on there. It should be 422, not 423. All right, first one is the parietal canthal Waters. So we just talked about this one, remember, but this time we're focusing more on the orbits. So for each of these projections of the orbits, I'm going to let you know kind of what they best visualize in relation to the orbits, okay? So for a Waters, it doesn't really best visualize any part of the orbit. It's more of a general overview of the orbit, okay? It just kind of gives you a different projection of the orbit. But it's not really the best for any particular area, but it does show you some particular fractures of the orbits that we need to be aware of, right? And the fractures that we need to look at are the tripod and the Lefort. Okay, so go back into your anatomy part of the text and look over tripod and Lefort. Tripod is where it kind of breaks off a portion of the orbit there. All right, so if we look here, all right, so a tripod would mean that you would have a fracture here, here, and then back here. So it kind of breaks off in three parts and it really breaks off this zygoma there. Okay, that is a tripod. Okay. Um, Lafort is kind of more of a different type of fracture you really don't see too often, but it's more of like just horizontal. You'll see horizontal breaks within the orbit itself. So it's not really anything um, like um, like a tripod fracture. It's more just you'll see like a line coming across there or a line coming across there is more like Lafort fractures. Okay, so but again, go back and look at those up. Make sure you understand those type of fractures. But the waters will best visualize the tripod and the Lafort. Okay. Again, put the chin up on the image receptor. Okay, which brings what positioning line perpendicular? MML, right? Make sure there's no rotation, no tilt, right? And once you have that MML perpendicular, right? What is the angle formed between the OML and the table? 37 degrees, right? And why is that important? Right? Hopefully you said it's important because it helps to place the ridges below the maxillary sinuses. Right? CR perpendicular to the IR, still exit at the acanthion, collimate, suspend respiration. Right? Now, again, this projection is supposed to be for the orbits, but most of the time you're going to just include all of the facial bones, right? They'll just do it as one projection. It'll be a facial bones projection, but it'll include the orbits. Important thing to remember for this one is to make sure that these ridges are below the maxillary sinuses, which they are, right? What angle between the OML and table helps to bring those ridges below? 37 degrees, right? What happens if they're located within the maxillary sinuses? That means that your head wasn't extended enough. You didn't have the MML perpendicular, okay? But now going back to the orbits, what are we looking at? We are looking the entire orbit, right? So again, it does show us the supraorbital, infraorbital margin. But is it best for any one of those? No. It is just an overall view of the orbits, not best for any top or bottom of the orbit. However, we can see tripod fractures, which would be tripod fracture would be fracture of that, right? Or we would be able to see a Lafort fracture, little line going across, okay? Optimal exposure factor, sharp lines, bony trabecular markings, all right? So again, remember, water's projection. What is it best visualized for the orbit? Not really anything. It's just a general view of the entire orbit. Okay. Caldwell. Now for the Caldwell, I can tell you that for the orbit, it is going to best visualize the supraorbital margin, right? So the top of the orbit. So it is best going to visualize this supraorbital margin right there. Okay. Reason for that is because we have that part on the image receptor, right? So it should be pretty parallel to the image receptor, which means that there should be no distortion of it. So when we look at this, we position this patient, we're going to do the exact same thing we've done for all PA Caldwell projections. What two structures need to be on the image receptor? Forehead and nose. What positioning line needs to be perpendicular to the image receptor? OML, right? What is the angle formed between the OML and the CR? 15 degrees, right? That's what makes it a Caldwell. Remember, you're going 15-degree caudate. Once you've done that, you're still going to center to exit at the nasion, collimate, suspend respiration. So really nothing's changed, right? Everything is the same. All we're doing is we're concentrating more on the orbits. All right, so again, for the orbits, what we're looking at is we're looking at this portion here, the supraorbital margin. So remember, Caldwell best visualizes the supraorbital margin, okay, with minimal distortion, okay? We can't evaluate the infraorbital margin because we're going to have the ridges in the lower 1/3 of the orbits. Okay, so because those ridges are there, we can't evaluate that lower part of the orbit. However, it does help us best evaluate the top part of the orbit. Make sure there's no rotation, no tilt, optimal exposure factors, of course, right? And of course, make sure that those ridges are in the lower 1/3. Remember, if they're too high or too low, if they're too high, that means that the angle between the CR and the OML was less than 15 degrees. If they're too low, the angle between the CR and the OML was more than 15 degrees, okay? All right, lateral facial bone. Again, general overview, lateral view of the orbit, not best for any one thing. We are looking for any fractures, pathologies, 70, 80 kVp, 40-inch SID. Put them in the erect or semi-prone as needed. And of course, get the head in a true lateral position, right? So those four things we always look for, right? IPL, perpendicular to the image receptor. MSP, the mid-sagittal plane, parallel to the image receptor. The IOML, perpendicular to the front edge of the image receptor. The GAL, parallel to the front edge of the image receptor. Okay. Once you get all that, get in a true lateral position. We're going to CR perpendicular to IR, and it's going to be the same centering as we did for the lateral facial bones. You're going to center to the zygoma, right? Or midway between the outer canthus and the EAM, all right? Oh, excuse me. All right. Once you've done that, collimate, suspend respiration. Again, we are looking at the orbit area. All right. Let's see what it looks like. All right. So we are focusing more on this orbital area there. Primarily what they're going to use this for is any type of anterior posterior fracture, separation fracture. So if maybe this part of the orbit comes forward, right, or this part goes backwards, they'll be able to see that. Okay. If maybe, you know, but down on the infraorbital margin, right, one goes forward, one goes backwards, they'll be able to see that on this lateral position, projection. Okay. We're still going to look at the same criteria for rotation and tilt. So if it's rotation, we're looking for the mandibular rami, make sure there's no anterior posterior separation. If they're superimposed, there's no rotation. For tilt, we're looking at the orbital plates, right, for any superior inferior separation. And then, of course, the three structures you can use for both are the EAM, cell turcica, greater wing. Okay. All right. So again, kind of going quickly because we've gone over these projections before. The last projection is the modified waters. Now, make note, this projection is used for what's called blowout fractures. Okay, that's mainly kind of what it's made famous for, is to look out for blowout fractures of the orbit. So what happens with a blowout fracture, right? And again, go back to your pathology to kind of look that over, right? But what happens is there's a structure within here, right? Like kind of like this part of the orbit there. Whoops, let me mark it. Kind of this part of the bottom part of the orbit kind of gets crushed into each other, and then like a little portion of it will go kind of down, you know, and it'll kind of get crushed in between. So it kind of blows that part out of where it should be. So that's kind of what a blowout fracture is, all right, is you'll get like a part coming this way, part coming this way, and then this middle portion kind of gets pushed down out of there, and that's where it breaks, okay? But again, this modified, we are looking at blowout fractures, right? And as far as visualizing the orbit, this is going to best visualize the infraorbital margin. So the bottom of the orbit, right, will best be visualized with this modified waters, right? And it's better visualized than the regular waters because there's less distortion, because there's less extension of the head, okay? So modified waters, best for visualizing the infraorbital margin. It is also best for an overall view of the orbit. I know I said waters will show an overall view of the orbit, the entire orbit, but the waters is even, modified waters is even better than the waters for an overall view, okay? But remember, for the top portion of the orbit is going to be the Caldwell still. This one will be for the infraorbital, okay? And then the best for a general overview is the modified waters still, okay? Now let's position it. 75 to 85 kVp, erector prone as preferred. So remember, start off by getting that chin, right, up against the image receptor to get the MML, but then you're going to decrease the extension and bring the lips meatal line perpendicular to the image receptor. All right, once you've done that, it's going to create a 55-degree angle between the OML and the image receptor. All right, now what happens with that, that increase in angle? Well, it brings your ridges up towards the maxillary sinuses. You're going to be in the lower half of the maxillary sinuses, okay? Make sure there's no rotation, no tilt. Collimate and suspend respiration. You're still going to center to exit at the canthion. Now remember, I told you there were three major changes between the waters and the modified. What was the first one? Or give me one of them, right? One of them should be that the LML is perpendicular as opposed to the MML. All right. Second one, give me a second one, right? The angle that's formed for the modified waters between the OML and the table is 55 as opposed to 37 for the waters. And then what is the last one? The last major change, right? Hopefully you said it's the location of the ridges, right? So in a modified waters, the ridges are going to be in the lower half of the maxillary sinuses, whereas with a regular waters, they're below the maxillary sinuses, okay? Now for orbits, what does this projection best visualize? Right? It's going to best visualize the infraorbital margin, the bottom portion of the orbit. All right. What fracture is it best for? The blowout fracture. Okay. So modified waters is the blowout fracture, whereas the regular waters is the tripod and the Lefort fracture. Which projection will best visualize the supraorbital margin? It should be the Caldwell. Okay. And what is the best one for an overall view of the orbit? Right. We come back to the modified waters. So hopefully you're making note of that. All right. Again, when we look at this projection, make sure that the ridges are in the lower half of the maxillary sinuses, which they are. All right. Again, we are trying to visualize this infraorbital margin, best visualized there, right? But you can see the entire orbit, right? It is best visualizes the entire orbit as well. All right. Also, make sure that there's no rotation, no tilt, optimal exposure factors. Right. Now, what happens if you see these maxillary sinuses below, these ridges below the maxillary sinuses? Okay, that means that for this modified, you had too much extension, right? You were in irregular waters as opposed to modified. What if you see these ridges go higher up into the maxillary sinuses? Well, then you had too much flexion, right? You didn't extend enough to bring that LML perpendicular. Okay. All right. So again, kind of a review over the orbits. Waters projection. What is it best? What fractures is it best for? Tripod and Lefort. What do we best visualize on the orbit? Not really best visualize anything. It just gives you a general overview of the entire orbit. Caldwell, right? What is it best for? Best visualizes the supraorbital margin or top of the orbit. Okay, minimal distortion. Lateral, just again, another overview of the orbit. You can see anterior, posterior separation of breaks. The modified waters, what fractures is it used for? Blowout. Okay, what's the what is the best visualized for the orbit? Well, best visualize the infraorbital margin, and it is also for the best overall view of the entire orbit. You're going to use the modified waters. Okay. What are the three differences between the modified and the waters? Right. Positioning line, LML for modified, MML for regular waters. The angle formed between the OML and the table for the modified is 55, whereas for the regular waters is 37. The position of the ridges in relation to the maxillary sinuses for the modified is they're in the lower half. For regular waters, they're below the maxillary sinuses. Okay, so those three things, make sure you understand that for the modified and the regular waters. All right, so let's go to these radiographs here. Which radiograph is suboptimal and should be repeated? Okay, so this is the lateral facial bone. All right, so I'll give you a couple seconds here. All right, so hopefully you said that it is A, that is a suboptimal and should be repeated. Okay, now let's look at A and what are the repeatable errors seen in the radiograph. Okay, I'll give you a minute here. All right, so again, what are the repeatable errors here? Well, what are the first things we check for, right, when we look in the lateral? Again, we check for rotation and tilt, right? So let's look at rotation. So we'll look at the mandibular rami here, right? So you see one line there, and then you see one line back there. So there is some major rotation there, right? Big time anterior posterior separation. So we have rotation. Second one is no marker, right? Let's check for tilt. Tilt, we're checking the orbital plates there, right here. We do see a little bit of superior inferior separation. So there may be a little bit of tilt there. Definitely rotation, maybe some tilt, no marker. All right, so let's see what we say here. All right, we have rotation, no marker. We didn't really account for the tilt because it probably wasn't going to be anything that needed to be repeated. Okay. Let's see, waters projection. What are the two repeatable errors present in radiograph B? So we're not even going to ask you, I'm not even going to ask you which one is the trouble one. We should know that B is the trouble one, right? Look at that thing. All right, A is the normal waters projection. B, no bueno. All right, so what are some things we see here? Of course, if you said no marker, obviously no marker, right? But let's check for other factors, right? Are there other things that we need to look for? Where should the ridges be in relation to the maxillary sinus? Well, they should be below, right? Like this one here. If you look here, right, that is the petrous ridge, and there is your top of your maxillary sinus, right? And the bottom is down here. So we see the ridge within the maxillary sinus. What does that tell us for a waters projection? Well, that means that We were not extended enough, right? Too much flexion. We were not extended to bring those ridges below the maxillary sinuses. Right? What's another thing we see here? Well, we definitely see some rotation, right? So if we look at the distance between the lateral orbit and the side of the head, whoa, big time rotation, right? And if this is the left side, we have big time rotation to the left, okay? So we have rotation, we have under extension, okay? Um, and that's basically what you see, right? There may be a little bit of tilt, but not much. But if you're looking at these structures here, right, you're saying foreign objects, those are hardware that they place to kind of keep the skull in place, because you can tell that you should see a line here, right, of where they kind of opened up the skull there. So they took a piece out and then they used those kind of hardware to keep that skull in place, right? Here it looks like some sort of shunt that they put in the head, right? That line right there should be like a shunt that they're trying to drain fluid or something. Okay. So there's really no foreign body in there. Okay, so let's see what the errors are right here. We had rotated, underextended, no marker. Okay, which is what we said. All right, lateral projection. Identify the position errors present in this radiograph. All right, so there are a couple of things wrong here, right? Again, what's the first thing we look for? Rotation, tilt, right? So let's look for rotation, right? So if we look at the mandibular rami, which are down here, we see one line there, one line in the back, right? So what does that tell us? We have rotation, right? Tilt, what do we look at? Orbital roof or orbital plate. We have one line there, one line there. What does that tell us? We have tilt, right? So we have both rotation and tilt, okay? What else? Collimation wise, we're good with collimation if you said collimation, because it's a facial bone, right? And we really want to get from the top of the frontal bone to the maxilla there, which we got, right? We got all the facial bones on there, right? But let's look at the actual image itself, right? If you notice, right, and just kind of look at the image, it's real grainy, right? So that tells you there's a problem with exposure, right? Either it was underexposed, or and that's basically what it tells you, it's underexposed if it's real grainy like that, because we still want to be able to see all these structures here. We don't want them to be underexposed. So we want to make sure that the exposure is correct in there. All right, so you have tilt, slight rotation, and you have some exposure problems. All right, what is the angle between the OML and the plane of the IR for a well-positioned parietal acanthial projection? So again, this is a Waters projection. So what is the angle that should be formed between the OML and the IR? Hopefully you said 37 degrees, because that's what it should be, right? Why is 37 degrees important to form that angle? Where does it place the ridges? Below the maxillary sinuses. All right, what is the angle between the OML and the plane of the IR for a well-positioned modified parietal acanthial? Well, you know it's not 37, right? For the modified, it's 55. And when you have this angle, where do the ridges now go? They go into the lower half of the maxillary sinuses. Okay. Which of the following projections would best detect a fracture of the orbital floor? Orbital floor. Okay. So again, we're looking for which is going to best show the infraorbital margin. All right. So SMV, we didn't even talk about that in orbit, so that's out. All right. PA Caldwell, right? That best shows the supraorbital margin, right? Parietal acanthial is just kind of an overview of orbits. This one here is going to best visualize the infraorbital margin. Okay, so B should be the winner there. Okay, just remember what fractures are seen with the regular Waters. Right, we have a tripod and the Lefort, whereas the modified is best used for the blowout fracture. Okay, and that's it, guys. So again, projections are the same. Just make sure that you go back and look over these projections. But once you look over them once, you'll have them for both projections. Look at the main differences between the Waters and modified Waters. Make sure you know those. Make sure you know which projections best visualize certain parts of the orbit, like the superorbital, infraorbital margins. Um, and that's, make sure you look at centering points. If you have any questions, again, email me, or you can talk to me in lab once we get in there. But make sure you look over this before you get in the lab, so that way when we get in there, it's just straight to positioning. When we position, it's going to be some of the same projections you've done before. But again, if we kind of repetition kind of makes us better at it, so we're going to just keep doing that. All right, guys. If you have any questions, let me know. Send me an email. All right, guys. That's it. I'll see you next time.